We figure out the best way to build for us is a steel frame. Put a steel frame in there, slap some bricks and windows on the outside, bingo, bango, bongo, you got yourself a skyscraper. The first skyscraper happened just in the shadow of this Art Deco building off to your right over the gray figurine on top of it. That is the Board of Trade. That gray figurine is the Goddess of Agriculture series. The very first skyscraper was about 2 blocks north of that, and it was 10 stories tall. 10 stories tall. About 100 years later, you see the Sears Tower was the skyline's king for about 20 years after its inception in 1973. That is 110 stories tall. As we come out from underneath, in between these trees, you'll get a view of all 110 stories of this 110-story masterpiece. Now, in terms of art, or architecture terms, excuse me, when we think of Sears Tower, I'm going to explain it more in depth later, but when you think of the Sears Tower, think of modernism, right? What is modernism? Oftentimes it is big, it is boxy, it is black, it is boring, and it is square. I wish it wasn't, but more often than not, it is. When you hear me reference modernism, just know right now you're still looking at the king of modernism. Now, what is modernism? Well, like I said, it's kind of big, boxy, boring, square. It is really from the 1960s and 70s, and it's kind of a reinterpretation of building. No matter how sexy the building you work in is, you still have to go to work on Monday. It is function over form. Now we can build it taller, lighter, less expensive. Same amount of function. And it kind of takes the art out of architecture. And we'll talk a bit more about modernism because, well, this early section is pretty much filled with modernism. Easy way to tell, a lot of glass and steel, and that's pretty much it on the visible side. But now I want to point out something underneath this modernist building on your left. Not only is Chicago a swamp, making it hard to build, many of the buildings, particularly on the west side of the river that we're going to see today, are now competing not just with the swamp, but with these railroad tracks underneath the city as well. And as we come underneath Jackson Boulevard, I want you to look off in the distance, because the more time we have to see it, the more sense it will make. You should see, as we come off, over on the left-hand side, you should see a red brick building with a clock on it, the Intellisat building. Now look at the building directly to the right of that. It is a 2-part gray structure. You see the tall, firmly painted part, which has the clock and the Boeing logo on top of it, and then the shorter part, which looks like those sort of triangular white trusses on the near side. This is our first example of getting creative with the railroad tracks. If you look at the portion with the white trusses on top of it, the southeast corner, so this corner of those white trussed short portion has no underground supports. The whole southeast corner of that building is built directly over these railroad lines. My little chicken legs that are supporting this 170-pound frame are doing more supporting of me than the southeast corner of this building is doing for this building. So how is this building staying upright and not falling into the river? Well, those metal trusses are connected to the larger portion of the building, which is firmly planted. Those large white trusses act as almost like an extendo arm from the tall portion, which is firmly planted, holding the short portion above the railroad tracks down below. If those trusses weren't there holding that building flat and level, those would have already sank into the railroad tracks and even worse, into the Chicago River. The good news and the bad news of this building. The bad news is it sounds pretty death-defying. It sounds even worse when you realize that's the Boeing building. The good news is it was not designed by Boeing engineers, so there's nothing to worry about. If you're going to fall out of something Boeing, it's going to be from a lot higher up. Don't worry. I asked guys, you can see we are going under some low bridges. Please don't reach up and touch those low bridges unless you'd like your nomination for the Darwin Awards to be a winner. If you do want to reach up and touch, they are hard, sharp, rusty steel. I do ask, as some of these bridges get lower and lower, particularly my front row here, if you could just remind me to duck every time. There's going to be 4 very low bridges we go under today. When I say low, I mean they might knock this water bottle over. So please, if you see me ducking, please duck. Now, as we come up, let's turn to our left, and you'll notice a building from the same era as a building on our right. They kind of share a similar outside aesthetic, but notice how the building on our right, this is not one of those low bridges. We still got like 3 or 4 inches, so we're fine. Please don't touch the temper in that bag. Right over to the right, notice how this building has its back to the river. It is the Civic Opera building. This was meant to be the most expensive and ornate opera house in America. But notice, it's sort of crossed the river brother, built at the same time. Well, it has a river-facing plaza. One of these is very strange for Chicago, the other isn't. The more commonplace is actually, in the 1920s, what the Civic Opera Building did, what is back to the river. Now, this building was, like I said, supposed to be the most expensive and ornate opera house in America. And it was, for a grand total of 11 days. This opened, as I said, in 1929, and it opened about 2.5 weeks before the stock market crash of 1929, the financial effects of which we are still suffering from. We'll talk about its neighbor on the other side, but look over to the left now. You can see the two parts of the Boeing building, and I promise you that's not even the most creative engineering, to stay on your left side and look past the Boeing building at the base of its neighbor. Look at how that building arcs inwards. This building is not supposed to exist. The building on your left side, straight ahead, that looks like a tuning fork, a glass of champagne, is a 56-story building with a base that is 39 feet wide. It has to be 39 feet wide, this concrete and steel base, because 42 feet, 6 inches apart underneath this building are active railroad tracks. There are trains that run every single day on both sides of this building. The only way that you could build that building is to have a base that only was 39 feet wide. Now, I'm not a mathematician. I just know that math doesn't seem to add up. To put that into human form, a 56-story building and a 39-foot base, I am 6'3". Ladies? I am 6'3". If I was this building, it's the equivalent of me standing on my tiptoes on top of a poker chip. Right? There is something inside that keeps this afloat, and it is, or upright, shall I say, and it's what's called a tuned mass damper. It is a sort of suspended, almost 300,000-gallon water tank acting as a giant pendulum. As wind blows one direction, the giant pendulum, thank you for your help on that one, the giant pendulum of water hidden internally swings back in the other direction, keeping that building upright. Like I said, that's one of our low bridges. We are going to have 4 low bridges. We're going to cross them 4 times. I appreciate you reminding me to duck. That does not go unnoticed. Well, welcome guys to the birth of Chicago. This area here is known as Wolf Point, or the confluence, because it's where the river comes together. And if you notice, kind of as we come from the South Branch, and we could turn off to the right on the main branch, or off to the left on the North Branch where we're going, kind of notice what shape the river takes on. And if you're having a tough time figuring out what shape the river takes on, have a look at this railing over underneath Salesforce Tower. Inside the circles of this railing, you should see a pretty common motif in the city of Chicago, which is the letter Y. The letter Y is a reference to Chicago's namesake, which is the Chicago River. This is not a river that runs through Chicago. This is a city of Chicago built around the Chicago River. Where does our namesake come from? Well, our original inhabitants, the Native Americans. And they figured out something pretty quick about this area, and that was that it was a swamp. And that nothing can really grow in a swamp. The only thing that they found growing on the banks of this then unnamed swamp was what they called Chicaquois, which means striped onions. Leeks, or ramps, is what the city of Chicago is named after. The folks who came sort of a generation after the Native Americans discovered Chicago were the French. If you know anything about how the French do to language, you know how exactly we got from Chicaquois to Chicago. And again, welcome to my home, the city of striped onions. It's not smelly or stinky onions, as some people say.